Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning. Thanks for joining us. Today, this discussion is part of the U.S.-China Dialogue 2020 event series. It was launched earlier this spring and hosted by the Georgetown Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue and the Asia Studies program at Georgetown. It features distinguished scholars and experts from both the United States and China for a timely and in-depth discussion on topics ranging from the coronavirus pandemic, the U.S.-China decoupling, and the presidential election. Videos of past events can be found on the initiative's website. The audience for today's program can submit their questions by email to uschinadialogue@georgetown.edu. That's all one word, uschinadialogue@georgetown.edu. I'm your host for this discussion, James Green, a senior fellow with the initiative. Today, we are excited to have Roy Camphausen join us for a discussion about the People's Liberation Army here on the day after Veterans Day. Roy, I've known for 2 decades. He's had 2 very successful careers, and today we get to hear about both of them. He's a graduate of Wheaton College and has a master's from Columbia University. In his first career, Roy served as a career Army officer and retired as a lieutenant colonel. He was a China Foreign Area Officer, and his career included assignments as China Policy Director for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, China Strategist for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and as a military attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, where I first got to know Roy a mere 2 decades ago. You can hear all about his military career and experience on our podcast discussion, which is part of a series. The series is called the U.S.-China Dialogue Podcast, available on the initiative's website, as well as Apple Podcasts and wherever you get your podcasts. In our discussion from that podcast episode, he talks about diffusing tensions from military accidents like the mistaken bombing of the PRC embassy in Belgrade in 1999 and the collision of 2 military planes off the Hainan coast in 2001. And the series talks to about 24 former US officials, cabinet officials, White House advisors from the normalization of relations with China in 1979 until today. And it's something we can get to a little bit later in our discussion of what the lessons are from those military incidents for today. Roy's second successful career has been in the think tank world. He joined the National Bureau of Asian Research in 2004, first as a senior vice president and now president of the organization. I should also add he was appointed in 2018, by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to be a commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. And during his time at NBR, the National Bureau of Asian Research, Roy has written and led research into a number of key areas of U.S. policy towards the Asia-Pacific, groundbreaking series on the People's Liberation Army modernization, as well as one of my favorites, the Commission report on intellectual property theft, which was originally issued in 2013 and then reissued in 2017. And I think in some ways formed a blueprint for how the Trump administration saw what should happen with tariffs on China regarding intellectual property theft. So really groundbreaking work. Roy frequently comments on U.S.-Asia relations to a wide range of media outlets, CNN, Financial Times, the New York Times. Really glad to have you here, Roy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, James.
Happy Veterans Day. I first lived in China in the early 1990s in a city that no one in America had heard of until the coronavirus. Yes, Wuhan, now infamous, is where I lived in the early 90s. What I remember about that time were we had these coupons for buying grain and oil, and there were 2 currencies, renminbi, people's money, and FEC, foreign exchange certificates. And then when you went anywhere, there were 2 or 3 or 4 ticket prices. There was one price for foreigners. Usually there was a price for average Lao Baixing, the average Chinese person. And then there was always a price for veterans that just seemed super low all the time. Without getting into too much detail about the pricing structure of China in the early 1990s, do the Chinese celebrate Veterans Day?
Thank you, James. And thanks again for the opportunity to be on your podcast some time ago. It's really a thoughtful effort, and I applaud your initiative and that of Georgetown to actually conduct those interviews and reflect on past periods of time in our bilateral relationship, especially as we're going through a particularly stormy period right now. China doesn't have a Veterans Day. China celebrates its veterans, but the youngest veterans in China are veterans of the 1979 border war with Vietnam. And so they're in their mid 60s. They're actually a pretty potent domestic political group, not terribly well organized, but upset with the treatment they receive, from healthcare to benefits to job placement. And so the Chinese government established a ministry for Veterans Affairs in 2018, as much to provide services to this group as to maybe keep control on some of their protest activities. The closest thing that China has to a Veterans Day, the way we celebrate it, it's really, the date is linked back to the armistice at the end of the First World War. And Veterans Day in America doesn't really celebrate any particular war. It celebrates those who served, right? In China, the closest they come, they celebrate the founding of the PLA on August 1st, but that's kind of like the Army birthday in the US. It's not really a Veterans Day event. The closest the Chinese come is what they call a National Defense Education Day. It occurs the third Saturday in September, which is a rather benign day, but it's linked, at least on the calendar, to a date of great humiliation within the Chinese history. And that's the September 18th, 1931 Mukden incident, when some Japanese Imperial Army provocateurs bombed a railway in what was then Mukden, now Shenyang, and that provided a pretext for the Japanese Imperial Army to occupy Manchuria, northeast China, in very significant ways from the early 1930s. So contrast celebration of the end of a war in the US, and then all those who've served since, with the Chinese motto, which is to remember a humiliation period. And that is what guides their thinking about veterans. It's quite a stark contrast, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. And maybe now in China, 11/11 is super famous holiday of sorts. It's a shopping holiday. It's become quite a commercial success, first from Alibaba and then from all the online retailers for Singles Day. Maybe akin to our, I don't know, Mother's Day or Black Friday, a kind of invented shopping holiday. And so there's a disparity there with what both countries do on November 11th. You had mentioned some of the founding of the PLA, August 1st. I always find it striking, and we discussed a little bit on our podcast episode, and thank you for the shout out, of the People's Liberation Army, unlike the US military, does not serve the state, doesn't serve the country, it serves the Chinese Communist Party. Can you just talk a little bit about why that's the case? And Xi Jinping has been portrayed, I think, in the Western press as amassing all this political power. And how has that affected how the PLA is managed or seen, or how they operate today?
Well, China's People's Liberation Army is a political organization first and foremost. The senior leaders of China's military find their identity first in their party position and then second in their military rank. And so it's quite possible to anticipate, even predict, the promotion to the very senior ranks of the PLA by understanding when a particular officer joined the Central Committee or was an alternate to the Central Committee. It's often the case that maybe 10 years later, a promotion to a very senior position then becomes evident. The Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, swears their allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party, not to the Constitution of China, not to the Chinese people. And so therein, I think, lies a second important point to understand. It's also the case that the Chinese military still has political commissars in operational units. And this practice, which the Soviet Union had as well, but it still confounds American analysts. To what extent does the political commissar's judgments or decisions impact on operational military decisions that his commander counterpart might want to make? It's a very fine balance. I think it would be a mistake for us to conclude this is necessarily a weakness, because it's been the case for 100 years, 99 years that the PLA has been around. So they've certainly developed some efficiencies. But it does speak to a rather different command and control climate. And in the hyper speed of modern warfare, it suggests a potential chink in the armor of the PLA.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, at the certainly government level, at province level, and the city level, there's that same overlay, right? That is, there's a a party secretary for a city or a province, and then there's the mayor or the governor. And so that dual system happens in the PLA, but it's replicated throughout the governance system in China. I wonder, you'd mentioned that you can tell who might get promoted depending on where they are in the Communist Party hierarchy. For the US military, can you tell at a senior level who might be promoted based on where they served overseas, or what base or what division that they commanded?
Much more difficult to make that sort of judgment. And in the United States system, the services promote, right? The Army promotes its own leaders. At the very top, the secretary and the chairman have a voice, and the Congress, of course, confirms general officers at the 3 and 4 star level. But you can't predict promotions simply where somebody served. Though if someone serves honorably and very successfully in a very difficult environment or in a combat zone, there is, I think, a reasonable expectation that that would be reflected in later promotions.
Well, I wanted to move to the broader big picture. There's a lot of talk of a new Cold War between the US and China. Lots of quote unquote experts, particularly foreign policy experts that are looking to make a name for themselves now have become experts on China, or the US and China. And there's talk of this inevitable conflict in some ways between the US and China, either under a Thucydides trap or the Chinese need to pass their dominion over the region or over the world will be unchecked because of the resources at their disposal. And oftentimes part of that likely conflict is seen as the spark might be an accidental military confrontation. And we talked on the podcast, and we've talked before about both the EP3 incident off Hainan in 2001 and the Belgrade bombing in 1999. You worked on both of those issues in uniform. How do you see the likelihood that a military accident or incident might kind of balloon into a larger military conflict?
I'm pretty sanguine about the limits to which an accident might escalate to broader conflict. I don't think it's likely. I think the possibility of great power war between the United States and China is mercifully low, but that's really almost not the central factor, right? We have, I think, strong reason to conclude that China doesn't want a big power war with the United States. Its actions in the South China Sea, which I think we're going to talk about more in a minute, really suggest that they would prefer to achieve their aims through activities that don't breach the risk of conflict with the US, that don't provoke the US to take actions that would lead to war. And of course, both sides understand the risks as nuclear powers, as global economic powers, with important relationships across the region and the world. The likelihood is not great, but that doesn't mean that the ever-increasing proximity and frequency with which the US and Chinese militaries, especially the navies and the Air Force, operate near each other in the littoral space off of the Asian mainland, that the increasing frequency with which that takes place does lead to questions and worries that accidents could ensue. I just think we need to be very cautious about thinking that two ships that shoulder each other, right, or an excessively close flyby by air assets would necessarily, without interruption, proceed to a broader shooting conflict. That's just, the leaders on both sides understand the risks of that and would act rapidly to tamp that down. It's in neither country's interests. But again, that's not really the point. The point is how do, especially from the perspective of the United States, how do we achieve our ends? How do we demonstrate fidelity with our allies and partners? How do we pursue American national interests in ways that don't provoke a conflict, but are very certain to push back against those efforts where China might try and get the US to back off some?
Yeah, so on that, I mean, those two incidents that I referred to were 20 years ago. I mean, I think what was shocking in some ways, for those of us who've spent our career on China, we had an idea of the way the Chinese system worked or didn't work. The idea that if you tried to call a Chinese official in the middle of a crisis, no one would pick up the phone. That there's a lot of risk aversion in the Chinese system. Certainly, telecommunications have expanded dramatically since that time. Um, how do you think, and then awareness of the other is also just much, much greater. I mean, realistically, any new Secretary of Defense in a Biden administration or the Secretary of State, one of the main issues they're going to be thinking about is how do I interact? How do I deal with China? That was not the case in 1999 and 2000. So the world's really changed a lot, both in the focus on China, the understanding of China, but also in the communication ability to actually pick up the phone and talk to somebody. So how do you see that, those changes from 2000 to today, addressing the point that you just made? That is, it's unlikely that a close incident or an actual incident in which lives are lost on some far corner in the Pacific Ocean will then end up being a crisis. How do you see those changes from then to now, bolstering what you're saying about that's unlikely to lead to a broader conflict?
Right. Remember our ambassador, Joe Prier, retired naval admiral and commander of U.S. then Pacific Command, was deeply frustrated after the EP3 situation because he thought he was the perfect guy to be able to address these challenges with Chinese counterparts. And as you said, James, he couldn't get somebody to pick up the phone for a while. I think the difference, at least one of the differences between then and now is, I think with the benefit of hindsight, we see that PLA obfuscation 20 years ago was done out of weakness. And the situation is much different today, right? The Chinese military has been on a 3.5-decade tear of modernization with advanced weaponry and systems fueled by a runaway economy that has allowed the Chinese state to fund its military without yet addressing the guns versus butter debate, right? They have not had to undertake that very fundamental set of considerations. What's also different is the mechanisms for communication now, right? In the old days, we had a White House link. Now the Secretary of State has a communications link, the Pentagon has a communications link. And that suggests that the increase in opportunities will improve the chances for communication. It was just 2 weeks ago that Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Chad Sabragia, it's the first DASD for China, had a risk management seminar with his Chinese counterpart using one of those communications links. And so I don't mean to say the problem isn't real. I think that both sides better understand what's at stake and would pursue the means to address it without escalating to a point where then things can get out of control. There is a case, though, there is a circumstance, there is a situation where common sense, risk management, de-escalation efforts just might not be enough, and that's concerning Taiwan. And we're in a very sensitive period right now. The PLA has ramped up its military pressure of Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party does not trust President Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan. They think she's on a path towards independence, and yet she's been, in my view, very moderate and has withstood the extremists in her own party who would pursue for that kind of political declaration, which ipso facto would be a red line for the Chinese state that they'd have to respond to. The US has leaned forward a great deal in terms of its own interactions. The highest political visitor to Taiwan and since establishment of relations between the US and PRC and the de-recognition of Taiwan in 1979 occurred just months ago when Undersecretary of State Keith Krach went to Taiwan. There's been a wide number of other initiatives that the US has put forward. Arms sales are always a factor that elicit responses from the PRC. And so this is a particularly sensitive time. Maybe you want to talk about it. There's been a big debate in the US about the question of strategic ambiguity.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, but go ahead. Yeah, what do you think about? Why don't you first set it up? I mean, strategic ambiguity is this idea that the U.S., after, as you say, ending our treaty relationship with the Republic of China on Taiwan, passed the Taiwan Relations Act, and that obligates us to support Taiwan's defense. And what does that mean? We've been quite ambiguous, and that's our policy, is strategic ambiguity, to not be clear about what it is we do to defend Taiwan. And that's for discussion. Sorry, that was just the setup. So where do you come out on changing that policy?
So the ambiguity is directed in at least two directions, right? One is to China, which is to enhance deterrence by giving the PRC pause as to what the US might actually do in a range of circumstances. The other is towards Taiwan. And it's Taiwan is a great partner, and Taiwan's success story in the face of COVID, I think speaks to how innovative the government of Taiwan is, how responsive to the needs of the Taiwanese people, despite the fact that they were largely shut out of assistance from the WHO.
Because they're not members, right? Just to be clear on that.
And because any information from the WHO had to be routed through the PRC representatives. A couple of working level meetings, they were allowed to have observer status, but not in every case. That's not really the point. And the point is that ambiguity is intended to convey to Taiwan that it's not yet clear. The circumstances matter as to whether and how the US might respond. So I think it's Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, who's made an elegant and eloquent argument that the time is past for strategic ambiguity, at least as it pertains to US and PRC. His argument is declarative statements lend themselves to stability, and the right kinds of declarative statements can enhance deterrence. In other words, if you tell the PRC directly what the US would do, that decreases the chances that they'll do something requiring the US to act on Taiwan's behalf. So I think two things. First, China already knows. It has known since 1995, 1996 that the US would be involved in at least some types of Taiwan contingencies. This is no mystery. They don't need a declarative statement in order to know that the US would be really centrally involved.
And just to be clear, that was a missile crisis, 1995-96, in which the mainland fired missiles towards Taiwan and the US sent aircraft carrier battle groups. Go ahead, sorry.
And the details of that are important, but the big picture is exactly as you described it. So it's no mystery to China, but a declarative statement does, in some respects, compel a Chinese response. And so the question is, do you precipitate the very crisis you're trying to avoid by stating something that's already well known by at least your counterparts in the PRC? And so I think that's a pretty important dimension. And there are other factors as well. Maybe we can talk about those as they come up, but that's I think the key one.
Yeah, I would just add one thing on the Taiwan side from the trade aspect, since I've spent 5 years in Beijing as the trade minister counselor. I hear a lot of strategic speakers or people who deal with foreign policy or defense policy say, oh, why don't we have an FTA, a free trade agreement with Taiwan? We're close to Taiwan. Taiwan is our top dozen trading partners. And I have two answers for that. One is there's not a lot of business community interest in it in the United States. That's already a pretty accessible market. There isn't a large need for that from the business community's point of view. The other one is, frankly, Taiwan is nowhere near where they need to be in terms of allowing normal trade to continue now. And I think for people who are in the strategic studies or foreign policy or defense policy community, an FTA just seems like you wave a wand and sure, have an FTA. It's not that easy. We've battled for a decade to get US pork and beef into the Taiwan market. And this shouldn't be that hard. There's a step before an FTA called a TIFA, a Trade and Investment Framework Agreement. And those talks broke down 5 years ago. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have an FTA with Taiwan, but what I'm saying is that's putting the cart before the horse. You need to have some discussion as to what the real market barriers are, and then there has to be political will in the United States. And I think Ambassador Lighthizer, the current U.S. Trade Representative, is correct to say, Congress has to support it. It's just not a high priority. Of all the things going on in the world on the trade side, an FTA with Taiwan, it's just not that high up. But on your earlier point about connectivity between the two governments and the DASD level negotiation, I would just say from my experience for the 5 years I was at the embassy doing trade 2013 to 2018, the explosion of WeChat and cell phones made it so that you could reach probably vice minister level officials, depending on the agency and the time, kind of when you wanted. I had a couple of uh, a couple of vice minister level people I could eat WeChat or could call. Other ones I couldn't. I remember one time our ambassador to the WTO, which is a kind of vice minister level official in the US system, the USTR deputy who serves in Geneva. And he said, James, can you give me the damn phone number of the vice minister of MOFCOM to just call him? And I said, sorry, their people below him are blocking and won't give that out. So those problems certainly do exist, and it depends on the official. But there are other ones that they said, oh yeah, here's my WeChat, contact me when you need something. So it really has changed a fair amount. And at the working level, our Chinese colleagues at the embassy in Beijing were in constant contact with their counterparts in the different ministries to set up meetings, to pass documents. And so that level of exchange is really much more robust than it was 20 years ago because the technology allows it. And all the Chinese government officials are on WeChat all the time, communicating with each other. So that's helped a fair amount. I wanted to move forward a little bit on one of the things that you had mentioned, which is the South China Sea as a potential flashpoint. Could you just step back a little bit and tell us what is the issue and how do you see what the PLA Navy has done in terms of reclamation efforts and installations? And is that something that should be of concern to the American population or to the Department of Defense? Where do you see the issues there and how do you see them unfolding?
There are a number of issues at play. I think the principal thing we want to learn from the South China Sea is the way in which China will study an issue and in this case, develop a solution that does not risk its fundamental priorities. And so you may recall in July 2010, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton gave a speech at the ASEAN Regional Forum in Hanoi, and she set out what US priorities would be for the South China Sea. And then our State Department, in a magnificent display of partnership and working with the other members of ASEAN states, had 8 or 9 of the other participating members echo the statement that she made. It was really a great day for American diplomacy. Unfortunately, the values we set forth were the Chinese judged that we would not fight for them. And then a couple years later, a senior American military leader said, we're not going to go to war over a pile of rocks in the South China Sea. Now that's a great military judgment. That's not necessarily the kind of judgment that a senior military leader should make publicly, because that's really in the domain of what our senior political leadership, the kinds of decisions that they should make. But what ensued then is the series of island building efforts that were incremental efforts to, some call it salami slice, and achieve objectives bit by bit over a period of time, the end of which you can really reset and be in a much better position. The name we call this now is gray zone operations, right? How do you operate in a setting in which you don't put at risk war with, in this case, the United States? Now, I have a great colleague at MBR, Admiral John Greenert, who was Chief of Naval Operations during that time, and he met frequently.
That's the senior most, so people know that's the senior most naval position in yeah. But go ahead.
He met frequently with his Chinese counterpart 5 times in 3 years, Admiral Wu Shengli, Victory Wu. And they talked about this. And he said, Wu, what's your end state? What's your desired outcome? What will you regard as success with regard to the island efforts? And Wu's answer was a process answer, not an outcome answer. Wu said, we thought you would push back. And when you didn't, we kept going. And remember, these were civilian engineer groups, right? Some people said this was a job interview for Chinese sea dredgers to be able to, do similar business all around the world. It's only subsequently that several of the locations have been militarized. And remember, Xi Jinping told President Obama, we're not going to militarize them. And yet it's hard
2015, right?
It's hard to dispute that that's exactly what has happened. Now, in terms of their value in an actual military conflict, it's negligible. They become targets. But I think we may have missed the point there. It's not their military value, it's what is conveyed to the regional states about the United States and the importance of our partnership with them and the risk that it puts them in one by one as the big Chinese state, in some cases, bullies them to achieve their own ends. So complex set of situations. Interestingly, very importantly, we learned our lesson in 2016. We had, I think, reason to believe that the PRC was going to attempt a similar effort near Scarborough Shoal. And we warned with statements, we ramped up our military operations in the region, and we clearly conveyed that this was unacceptable, and they backed off. And so there is it's not just once they start, we have to either go to war or give in. Those are two very stark options. There actually is room in the middle, and we successfully did that in 2016.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think there's one of the reasons I did the podcast project was to show, actually, if you spend a lot of time on something, you can get the Chinese side to move towards what the United States wants, whether or not it's non-proliferation in the 1990s or climate change in the late 2010s. Through being clear and having a priority, you can actually get something to move the way you want. I wanted to piggyback off your comments about Admiral Greenert and talk a little bit about mil-mil relations, military-to-military relations, something you've been involved with both in uniform and out. Admiral Prier is the one who basically said, I want to stay close to these people to know what they're going to do. I don't want to have to be distant. During Secretary Rumsfeld's time at the Pentagon, there was some strict orders and rules on how the two militaries should be interacting. I think one of the things that was the purpose of the interaction was to have a sort of deterrence of if you show the Chinese military are big bells and whistles, they'll be deterred from doing certain things. In my view, that's been misinterpreted today to mean, oh, gee, the whole thing was a failure. The PLA is modernized and we should have been able to head that off. In my view, that's a false assessment. You can't have expected showing an aircraft carrier to a PLA colonel to be the thing that the Chinese would then say, oh, we're not going to build our own aircraft carrier. I think that's the wrong way to do it. But how do you assess now, again, 15, 20, 30 years later, how that military to military engagement has gone? And as you say, in some ways, China's military is more confident, and that's probably better for us. If they're less cagey, they're more willing to interact with us as equals, and maybe that makes it a better conversation. But how do you assess kind of how that mil-mil diplomacy has gone?
I'm not going to sign up for your last statement because their confidence is based. It's not based on real operational experience. It's based on these grand and grandiose judgments about a declining U.S. and a rising China. The fact is, militaries are good when they operate, and the Chinese military doesn't operate. Then Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, I think, had a brilliant way of characterizing this. He said, if I'm going to war, the adversary I want to fight is one whose officer corps has not had live bullets shot at them in anger. And just so you know, you're that kind of military. His counterpart was the Chinese Minister of Defense. He said, my officer corps, 60 to 70% of my officers, and an even higher percentage in my line units, have been in combat, suggesting that there's a dynamic that can be overlooked and maybe mischaracterized by the Chinese side. So this is a huge part of our deterrent package. But back to your question about mil-to-mil, there's been phases of our mil-to-mil relationship, right? In the 1980s, after the establishment of diplomatic relations, we did a range of activities. We had foreign military sales programs to the People's Liberation Army because it was a different strategic environment, right? We were enticing the Chinese to lean towards us in the geostrategic challenge that we faced with the Soviet Union, and they faced as well. That all ended in the 1989 to 1991 period, right? Tiananmen Square massacre, the Gulf War, when the Chinese military realized, wow, we are so far behind. And then the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 meant the strategic rationale for that partnership had gone away. And so the 1990s were a period of fits and starts, right? The Chinese side was shocked to see the Americans send 2 aircraft carrier battle groups to the Taiwan Strait area. Shocked, not least because they may have well shot inert missiles to the north and the south, right? They thought the military theater that was being employed would be understood by the Americans. Well, that that then led to a policy of deterrence through deep engagement, which you've cited. At one point between 1997 and 1999, before the Belgrade bombing incident, I think we brought all 7 members of the Central Military Commission to the United States. And the intent was to deter by showing them the capabilities of the US military. The Congress judged that this was an overstep. And so the National Defense Authorization Act of 2000 said that the US military had to restrain itself. And that really fed then into the judgments of the Rumsfeld Department of Defense in terms of limiting contacts so that we didn't inadvertently benefit the Chinese side. But then the US was distracted. 2 wars, a decade. PLA modernization considered a pace with not much challenge from the US side. And the end of the decade, the great financial crisis led China to believe that their moment was now and that the US was in decline in ways that we couldn't challenge. And so that really set up the periods of the 2010s that we talked about earlier, where they looked for opportunities to challenge the US in ways that would not provoke great power war. We're actually at an interesting place now. We've given up on the notion that we can deter through engagement. Frankly, that's not possible any longer. And it was a short-term goal anyway, right? You deter the top leaders through demonstrating to them what war would look like. You don't deter the colonels and the captains who maybe get pretty fired up to take their shot at a future point. Now we're at a phase where we're doing things like risk mitigation, risk management, and conflict de-escalation efforts. And that's probably about the best we can hope for. You may remember when you were on the policy planning staff years ago, we had a discussion one day and you said, there must be something we can do in the mill-to-mill sphere that can stabilize the military relationships so that we can make political gains. Now we're at the point where it's really just about how do we limit the risk of things really getting out of hand. And that's probably a more realistic place to be at this point.
Yeah, it's a fair point on Chinese self-confidence or arrogance. I think the mill sphere isn't the only place you see that. And I think it's double-edged. I really do think, I mean, I remember when we were in Beijing at the embassy in the late 90s, if you took a Chinese contact out for a meal, they couldn't reciprocate. They didn't have enough money to take you out to a restaurant. So they would invite you to their house. It's a very nice meal, but there was that real kind of financial and personal imbalance. And you were traveling all over the world to go home or for whatever it was, because air tickets were not particularly expensive. But for a Chinese contact, someone who may be in the ministry or maybe in a think tank, there's no way they could do that. And now just saying that then based on the fanciness of the cars of the US embassy in Beijing, Chinese employees, I can afford the Mercedes and the BMWs that are in the parking lot of the US embassy in Beijing. And so in some ways that change in just personal circumstance has made interaction kind of easier. There's less of that, you're the rich country, we're a poor country. There's more, as I said, self-confidence that I think does help to have a real discussion. All of that said, there is still, as you say, this kind of arrogance that because the Chinese market is so large and so many things have happened in China over the last decade and a half, sometimes what comes out of the mouths of Chinese government officials is not based on reality. It's based on their perception of where China is. And that can be quite dangerous, certainly in the military sphere, but also in the kind of technology or economic sphere in which the Chinese government at the moment feels like, its system of a state capitalism is really best. And it's better than, if you look at the way that they dealt with financial crisis that you mentioned, but also the pandemic, their view is, hey, our political economic system is better suited. And that gets to the broader kind of issue of a potential ideological conflict with the US globally. But before getting to those sorts of questions, I just wanted to ask, you had mentioned PLA modernization, and I wanted to ask you what we should be paying attention to. In my discussion with Dennis Wilder, who's at Georgetown, was kind enough to support the podcast project, he called the PLA in the 1980s, when he started watching it, the world's largest antique army. And he said, look, now it's a modern fighting force. what should we be paying attention to? And by we, I mean kind of non-experts in PLA modernization. What is it that's important? What is it that they've done that actually changes the military balance, or are the things that we should be watching out for?
Well, the military reforms of 2015, 2016 are notable in many respects. The structure of the PLA prior to that inhibited the PLA's own desire to think of itself as an increasingly globalized force. And so the restructuring of military regions to theater military commands, smaller in number, more externally focused, with more modern systems, has enabled the PLA to think of itself in operating outside of China's borders. It's not so long ago that the PLA would say, and with a straight face, we will never operate in a foreign country. But at least since 2005, 2006, they have been doing that. And so that reorganization, I think, is an important factor. There's also the sense that training has become much more realistic. But here, we have to listen to what they say about themselves. Xi Jinping has repeated this idea of the five incapables. Their judgments about their leaders to operate and command within high demands, military modernization, high-tech military operations is really limited. And they have to make dramatic progress in order to be to achieve their aspiration of being a world-class military by mid-century. Now, our challenge is not to conflate their aspirations to be a world-class military, which are really for domestic consumption more than anything else. We need not conflate that with our judgments about whether the PLA is a peer competitor or not. Because the PLA is not yet operating globally in the ways that the United States does, it's really hard to think of them in that sense. But close to China, it's a pretty formidable force. And your colleague and our friend at Georgetown, Evan Medeiros, has written recently, we're faced with this uncomfortable reality that the US-China relationship broadly has entered a new normal of persistent and consistent tensions. And the military piece of this is in, as I mentioned earlier, the littoral space off of China's coast. And it's really irresolvable. The US has pledged to operate, sail, fly wherever international law allows. And the Chinese military do not want us to operate within the first island chain. And so
And sorry, just to be clear, the first island chain is where?
From the Kamchatka Peninsula down through Japan, Taiwan, and then down through Southeast Asia. So encompassing the East and South China Seas. They want to regard that as their own protected area for operating independently without pressure from a foreign military. We can accede to that. Those are high seas. There are protections that are offered for operating in those dimensions outside of the exclusive economic zones of the littoral states that we can agree to those demands. And so there are tensions there that can't be resolved. They can be managed. They can be prevented from going to conflict, but we are in, as Evan has said, this new uncomfortable position of persistent and consistent tensions.
I wanted to follow up, and then there was a question I want to read you, but I wanted to follow up on one point that you said about the PLA. In some ways, the modernization drive is a domestic propaganda effort as much as it is a kind of global footprint. I think some strategists in the U.S., when they see China's assertiveness on the diplomatic stage, lead them to conclude that China will have basing agreements around the world similar to the United States, so that in 50 years, PLA units will be operating in Africa and Middle East and Latin America. How do you see what the PLA is looking for? You mentioned the close in around China, and I think you did a great job on that. But on the kind of broader places around the world, will we see a large number of PLA basing agreements, again, in these other places around the globe, but not East Asia specifically?
So the Chinese base in Djibouti is not the prototype. There are unique reasons for that, not least that Japan has a base there. There are Chinese operations supporting the anti-piracy efforts in the Gulf of Aden. There are a lot of UN peacekeeping, Chinese participation, US peacekeeping efforts on the African continent. Djibouti's not the model, but there will be. It is, I think, beyond the point of debate. There will be new Chinese access arrangements throughout the world, and they'll expand, and they'll be linked to China's geopolitical efforts. There'll be some connectivity to Belt and Road initiatives. I think the challenge for us is to understand how they are constructing them, not assume that they will look like American, the American formulation. 15 years ago, I wrote a piece that said this is what would sort of happen, and I think we're seeing it come to pass. The idea of stationing troops on the order of what the US does is unlikely. I think we're likely to see places where they're dual use civilian military ports. There are places where the PLA Navy can pull in for rests and refit and reconstitution. There'll be a small cadre of folks there to facilitate commercial transactions for logistical support. And we're likely to see a fair amount of those. I don't think they're any less challenging. It's just maybe the model is not the large number of troops based in an overseas location that maybe we've seen for ourselves.
Super helpful. Maybe we could just end with, there's a question from the audience on Taiwan, and I'll just read it out, and after this we can conclude. This says, Roy, you said a military accident is unlikely to escalate into a major conflict. Do you feel the same about the minimal danger of escalation after a deliberate military attack on Taiwan or one of its islands if the US comes to Taiwan's defense?
Well, a deliberate effort, either against the main island of Taiwan or one of the offshore islands, is an entirely different matter. And it requires the United States to think beyond the incident, right? It's not just a matter of getting ourselves to the place where we can say we're back to status quo ante. We have to respond in the ways that will deter further efforts along the same lines. And we have to be mindful that Taiwan has a domestic polity as well. And if China takes an offshore island for whatever set of reasons, there'll be an imperative to act on the part of the Taiwanese armed forces. And when I've been a part of war games or tabletop exercises that have played this out, it's typically the case that the US seeks to restrain Taiwan in the interest of greater stability. Now, I'm not suggesting that's always wrong. What I am saying is that results in a de facto change in the status quo that advantages the PRC. And so we have to think beyond the incident. Do we go to war over an offshore island? That's a hard question. But what's after the offshore island? And American political and defense and national security leaders have to think in the broader context, not just about the single incident. So I don't know if that's an entirely satisfactory answer, but it's a hard question. And we have to be ready for it because the pressure, PRC pressure on Taiwan is unremitting.
Roy, we'll leave it there. Thank you for discussion today. Thanks for the US-China Dialogue podcast appearance. Really appreciate your support there. Look forward to keeping the conversation going. And thanks to our friends at Georgetown for hosting.